The morning of the signing, my son straightened his tie in my hallway mirror and smiled at himself the way he always did when he thought he had won something. I watched him from the kitchen doorway, my coffee going cold in my hands, and I thought about the 43 years I had spent in this house. The scuff marks on the baseboard where he used to kick his sneakers off. The height chart penciled inside the pantry door, still there under 3 layers of paint if you looked hard enough. The window above the sink where I had stood every morning for 4 decades, watching the same elm tree lose its leaves and grow them back. He didn't look at any of that. He just looked at himself. "The Hendersons are bringing their realtor at 2, he said, turning from the mirror. "I told them you'd have everything signed." I nodded and took a sip of my coffee. I didn't tell him what I had done the week before. I want to be fair to my son. I want to say that I believe, somewhere deep under all of it, he started out thinking he was helping me. That's what I told myself in the beginning, anyway. When he first sat across from me at this same kitchen table 2 years ago with a yellow legal pad and a concerned expression, I thought he was just being a good son. Worried, attentive. He had driven 4 hours from Columbus to have that conversation, which I took as a sign of how seriously he meant it. "Mom," he said, "I've been doing some research about what happens to people our age when things go sideways." Our age. I was 67. He was 39. I noticed the phrasing but let it go. He talked for a long time. About probate court and nursing home costs and the nightmare scenarios he had read about online. He had printed out articles. He stacked them on the table, like evidence. He told me about a woman in his office whose mother had been left with nothing because she hadn't planned ahead. He said he didn't want that to happen to me. "You've worked your whole life for this house," he said. "I just want to protect it." The house. 2 stories. Pale yellow siding, a porch swing that creaked on the left side. My husband Daniel and I had bought it in 1987 with a down payment we'd saved over 6 years. Daniel died 11 years ago. The house had been mine alone since then, and I had managed it fine. Paid the taxes, fixed the roof, refinished the floors myself with help from my neighbor Margaret, who was 71 and owned more power tools than anyone I had ever met. But I was 67, and my son was sitting across from me with a stack of articles and worried eyes, and he was my son. So I listened. The trust was his idea. A revocable living trust, he called it. He had already spoken to a lawyer, he said, already had the paperwork drafted. All I needed to do was sign, and the house would be protected. Protected from what, exactly? He was vague about. From probate, he said. From the government. From complications. Who controls it? I asked. You do, he said. Completely. It's your trust. You're the trustee. He slid the papers across the table. I should have called my own lawyer first. I know that now. There was a sentence midway through the document, in a font slightly smaller than the rest, that named him as successor trustee in the event that I became incapacitated or otherwise unable to manage the trust assets. I asked about it. He explained it away in about 30 seconds, something about how it was standard language, how it would only ever matter if I was completely incapacitated, how it was really just a formality to avoid the courts getting involved. I signed. I am a retired school teacher. I taught 7th grade English for 29 years. I have read more documents than most people see in a lifetime, and I signed because he was my son, and I was tired, and I thought love was the same thing as trustworthiness. It is not the same thing. I know that now, too. The first sign came 8 months later, not from my son, but from my granddaughter. She was 19, home from her first year of college, sitting at this same kitchen table, eating cereal at 11 in the morning the way teenagers do, and she said, very casually, the way you say something. You assume the other person already knows. Dad said you're probably moving next year. I set down my dish towel. Did he? I said. He said the house is getting too big for you. That you'd be happier somewhere smaller. She looked up. Something in my face made her put her spoon down. You knew about this, right? I told her I did. I kept my voice even. She knew I was lying. My granddaughter has always been able to read me the way I can read her, which is the particular gift and curse of grandmothers and grandchildren. She watched me for a moment, and then she said, quietly, Grandma, what's going on? I told her I wasn't sure yet. I told her I would figure it out. That night I sat at the kitchen table alone and went through every page of the trust document again. This time, I read it the way I should have read it the first time, slowly, with a pen, marking every phrase that made me stop. By midnight, I had 7 marks on 7 different pages. The language about successor trustee was broader than my son had described. It didn't require complete incapacitation. It required only a letter from 2 physicians stating that I was experiencing diminished capacity to manage financial decisions. 2 physicians. That was all. And my son, as successor trustee, would have full authority to sell, transfer, or otherwise dispose of any asset held in the trust, including the house. I thought about the conversation we'd had 6 weeks earlier, when he'd mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he'd been talking to my doctor. Just checking in, he said, keeping in the loop. I had thought it was sweet. I had thanked him. I did not sleep that night. The next morning, I called Margaret. She came over with coffee cake and sat across from me at the table and listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Dorothy, you need a lawyer. I told her I was aware of that. Not his lawyer, she said. Yours. Her own attorney had handled her late husband's estate, and she trusted him completely. She called him while she was sitting at my table and made me an appointment for the following Tuesday. His name was Gerald Watts, and he had an office above a dry cleaning shop on Maple Street, and reading glasses he wore on a beaded chain around his neck. I liked him immediately. He read the trust document in about 20 minutes, making small sounds I couldn't interpret, and then he set it down and looked at me over his glasses. When did you sign this? He asked. I told him. And you had no independent counsel at the time? I had not. He nodded slowly. The successor trustee clause is concerning, he said. It's broad. Broader than I would have advised had you come to me before signing. He paused. The good news is that you signed it as a revocable trust. You have the right to revoke it at any time. Entirely. Today, if you want. I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't known was clenched. What does revocation look like? I asked. He explained. A notarized revocation document filed with the county recorder's office, rendering the trust null and void. The house would revert entirely to my name, as it had always been. My son would have no authority over it whatsoever. He'll find out, I said. Yes, Gerald said. When you choose to tell him, or when he checks. He folded his hands on the desk. I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about your answer. Do you want to do this quietly, or do you want him to understand what happened and why? I thought about my son adjusting his tie in my hallway mirror. I thought about him calling my doctor. I thought about my granddaughter asking if I knew I was moving next year. Both, I said. Gerald smiled. Then here's what I'd suggest. We filed the revocation that afternoon. Gerald handled everything. The document was notarized, recorded, and officially filed by 3 o'clock. The house was mine again, cleanly and completely, with no asterisks. But we didn't tell my son. What we did instead required patience, which I have had a great deal of practice cultivating over 29 years of 7th graders. Gerald reached out to a realtor contact of his, a woman named Diane, who specialized in exactly the kind of transaction my son was apparently planning. My son had already, Gerald discovered through a careful series of calls, been in contact with a buyer, a developer. He had described himself as the managing trustee of the property, and had been conducting negotiations for several weeks. There was a signed letter of intent. There was a proposed closing date. He had been moving fast, which told me he was either confident I wouldn't find out or confident I couldn't stop it. He was wrong on both counts. But I wanted him to know that. I didn't want a quiet legal reversal that happened off to the side while he was looking somewhere else. I wanted him to sit down across from me the way he had sat across from me 2 years ago with his stack of printed articles, and I wanted him to understand exactly what he had done and exactly what I had done about it. So we let the signing proceed. Gerald prepared a folder for me. Clean, navy blue, my name on the tab. Inside, it was the recorded revocation document, a letter from Gerald formally notifying the buyer that the trust had been dissolved and the seller had no authority to convey the property, and a single page that Gerald had written himself, summarizing the situation in plain language. He also prepared, at my request, a letter from me. 3 paragraphs. I wrote it myself, and he reviewed it. I won't quote it in full, but the last line was, "I am not incapacitated. I am not diminished. I am your mother, and this is my house, and I would like you to remember that for the rest of your life." The morning of the signing, my son arrived at 9. He was wearing the gray suit he wore when he wanted to project competence. He brought a box of donuts, which he set on the counter without offering me one. He walked through the living room, checking his phone. The buyer and his realtor were coming at 2. Gerald would arrive at 1:55. I made lunch. I asked my son about his drive. I asked about his wife, about the kids. He answered in the clipped, distracted way of someone waiting for something else to start. At one point, he looked around the kitchen with an expression I recognized as assessment and said, "You know, you could probably get a good price on the furniture too. Some of this old stuff is actually worth something." I said I'd keep that in mind. At 1:45, my granddaughter arrived. I had called her the week before and told her what was happening and asked if she wanted to be there. She said she wouldn't miss it. She sat down at the kitchen table with her hands folded and her jaw set, and she looked so much like her grandfather in that moment that I had to look away. My son stared at her. "Why are you here?" "Grandma invited me," she said. He started to say something else, but the doorbell rang. The buyer was a man in his 50s, broad-shouldered, pleasant enough. His realtor was a woman in a red blazer. They came in and shook hands and set their briefcase and folder on the dining room table. My son was all warmth and efficiency, guiding them to chairs, making small talk. He had done this before, I could tell. He was comfortable in the role. Then Gerald knocked. My son turned. He looked at Gerald. He looked at Gerald's navy suit and his briefcase and the beaded chain on his reading glasses. He looked at me. "Who is this?" he said. "My attorney," I said. Something moved through my son's face. Not guilt. Not yet. Confusion first. Then a beginning of something harder. Gerald set his briefcase on the table, next to the buyer's folder. He nodded pleasantly to the room. The buyer's realtor looked between Gerald and my son with an expression of professional wariness. "I don't understand," my son said. He was looking at me. "Mom, what is this?" I sat down at the head of the table. "My table, in my dining room, in my house. Sit down," I said. "Please." Gerald opened his briefcase and placed 3 copies of the revocation document on the table. He placed the letter to the buyer. He placed a copy of the county recorder's stamp that made everything official. He explained in the calm, measured voice of a man who has done this many times that the trust had been revoked 6 days prior, that the property in question had never legally been the seller's to convey, and that any agreement made on the basis of that trust was without legal foundation. He was not unkind. He was simply clear. The buyer's realtor picked up the recorder's document and read it. She read it again. She looked at my son with an expression that required no translation. My son's face had gone through several changes during Gerald's explanation. Confusion became. Comprehension became something I can only describe as the look of a person who has walked confidently into a room and found that all the walls have moved. "Mom," he said. His voice was different now, smaller. "When did you—" "6 days ago," I said. "But why didn't you just—" He stopped. Started again. "You could have called me. You could have just called me and told me you wanted to change things." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about all the things I could have said. I thought about calling my doctor, about moving next year, about the furniture being worth something. "You could have called me first," I said. "Before you started negotiating the sale of my house." The buyer said something quietly to his realtor. She nodded. They gathered their papers with the careful, neutral efficiency of professionals who understood that this meeting was over and that none of it was their fault. The buyer paused at the door and looked back at my son with an expression that was not angry, just tired, and said, "I'll need the deposit returned by the end of the week." Then they left. The three of us were alone. Gerald, my granddaughter, my son. My son sat down. He sat down hard, the way you sit when the legs decide before the mind does. He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands. He stayed that way for a while. My granddaughter looked at me. I shook my head slightly. We waited. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. He was not a man who cried easily, and I could see him fighting it. And despite everything, some part of me ached to watch it. He was still my son. He was still the boy who used to kick his sneakers against that baseboard. That doesn't go away, no matter what else is true. "I thought I was helping," he said. "I know you did," I said. "In the beginning, I was worried about you. You're here alone. And the house is getting harder to—" "To what?" I said, not angrily. Honestly, to manage? I replaced the water heater last spring. I repainted the porch. I filed my own taxes. I manage it fine. But what if something happened? What if you got sick? Then I would call you, or Margaret, or Gerald. I would make arrangements. I am 68 years old, not incapacitated. I paused. That word was in the trust document. By the way, did you read the whole thing? He was quiet. "The clause that made you successor trustee," I said. "It didn't require me to be completely incapacitated. It required 2 letters from doctors. You had already been calling mine. Did you think I didn't know that?" He looked at the table. "I wasn't going to," he stopped. "I wasn't going to do anything without talking to you first." "You had a buyer?" I said. "You had a letter of intent. You had a closing date. When were you planning to talk to me?" He didn't answer that. We sat in silence for a while. Outside, the elm tree dropped a small branch in the wind, and it tapped against the window above the sink. And I looked at it the way I had looked at it 10,000 times from this same position in this same house, and I thought about Daniel and about what he would have said in this moment, and I thought he probably would have let me handle it. "I don't want to lose you as my son," I said finally. "That's not what today is about." He looked up. "But I need you to understand something. This house is not a problem to be solved. It is not an asset to be managed. It is my home. I raised you in it. I grieved your father in it. I intend to grow very old in it, and if the day comes when I truly cannot manage alone, I will tell you. I will ask for help. But the asking has to come from me." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. It was such a young gesture, such a boy gesture, that it broke something open in me. "I'm sorry," he said. And I believed him, partly the way you believe someone who has done a real thing and is genuinely sorry and also genuinely uncertain whether they would do it again under different circumstances. Remorse and change are not always the same visit. "I know," I said. My granddaughter reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything. She was 20 years old, and she already understood that some moments don't need words, which is more than most people learn in a lifetime. Gerald gathered his papers quietly and let himself out. I heard his car start in the driveway, and then there was just the kitchen and the elm tree, and my son sitting across from me with his expensive tie loosened and his careful competence entirely gone. I got up and cut him a piece of coffee cake that Margaret had left on the counter. I set it in front of him. I poured him a glass of milk. He looked at the plate and then at me, and for a moment he was 9 years old again and nothing in between had happened yet. "Thank you," he said. I sat back down. We talked for 2 hours that afternoon. Not about the trust, or the buyer, or the documents, but about other things. About his father. About what he remembered about this house growing up. About a summer when he was 12, when we drove to Lake Erie, and got caught in a rainstorm and ate soggy sandwiches in the car, and laughed so hard my husband had to pull over. He hadn't thought about that in years, he said. I thought about it often. He left at 5. He hugged me at the door. A real hug. Not the dutiful one-armed kind he had been giving me for years. I stood on the porch and watched his car back out of the driveway, and I thought it was entirely possible that today had been the most honest conversation we'd had in 2 decades. That evening, Margaret came over with wine, and I told her everything, and she sat back in her chair and said, "Good," with the deep satisfaction of someone who has been rooting for you from the beginning. We watched the sun go down through the front window, the elm tree going gold and then orange and then dark, and I thought about what Gerald had said in his office. Quietly, or so he understands what happened. Both, I had told him. I had wanted both. I got both. There are things they don't tell you about getting older. They tell you about the knees and the sleep and the reading glasses that migrate to every surface of every room. They don't tell you about the way other people start to treat your life as a logistical situation. The way they begin to talk about you in the third person while you're in the room. The gentle, patient, utterly condescending way they explain your own circumstances to you, as if age had relocated your brain to somewhere less accessible. I have been a widow for 11 years. I have planted and replanted the garden in the back. I have learned to use the router my grandson left here by accident and taught myself 3 new recipes every winter. I read 2 books a week and vote in every election and call my sister in Portland on Sundays and remember every birthday in the family, always, without a phone reminder. I am not a problem. I am a woman who has been living her life in this house for 43 years and who intends to keep doing exactly that for as many more years as I am given. And when the time comes, if it comes when I need help, I will ask. That is my right. The asking is mine. This house is mine, not because of any document, not because of any legal trust or revocation or county recorder's stamp, though I am grateful for all of those things. Mine because Daniel and I chose it together on a cold November afternoon in 1987 and stood in the empty living room, imagining furniture. Mine because my son learned to walk in the hallway and my granddaughter learned to bake in this kitchen, and the elm tree in the front yard has been my quiet company through every winter I have spent here, and it does not need me to explain my decisions to it, and neither, frankly, does anyone else. My granddaughter called the next morning, early. "How are you feeling?" she asked. I looked out the window above the sink. The elm was still there. "Good," I said. "Really good." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that I have turned over in my mind many times since. She said, "You know what I kept thinking about yesterday? You didn't need to do it that way. You could have just filed the paperwork and been done with it. Nobody would have known." "I would have known," I said. "That's why I love you," she said. I made my coffee. I stood at the window. I was in no hurry. I had nowhere I needed to be except here, in this kitchen, in this house, which is mine, which has always been mine, which will go on being mine for as long as I choose to stay.